Well, welcome back to Open Exchange. Now, the South African Banking Risk Information Centre, better known as Sabric, has praised the police for the decrease in cash-in-transit heists in the past financial year. Now, joining us to explain more on this is Kevin Twynham, General Manager for Violent Crimes at Sabric. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. I guess the positive feat, you've got your bank robberies down by 80% and cash-in-transit heists down by 20%. Well, how did you do this?
Morning. Well, I think it's a combination of efforts by, firstly, obviously the criminal justice system, the South African banks, the CAT companies, cash and transit companies, and then obviously the independent ATM deployers.
But looking at that, it was bad for a long time, so people must have started doing things differently. You mentioned the criminal justice system, but we know it's overloaded. We know that there's a long pipeline of cases. We know that arrests don't result in conviction. So how did you change that? Because, well, it's a deterrent, certainly. There must be a deterrent aspect, and there must be a conviction aspect.
Certainly, David. The obviously arrests are very important, which have been significant, played a significant role. But I think that firstly, the sharing of information intelligence amongst those role players, internally amongst the banks themselves, amongst the banking industry and the criminal justice system, for that matter, the cash and transit companies, all of that has played a major role.
Intelligence, I would think, is a key thing here. Now, in one way you can come and talk to us, but you can't tell us exactly how you did it, because that'll give the game away to the criminals. But that must have been a huge part, and it raises questions about why can't the rest of the criminal investigation area do similar things?
Obviously, a bone of contention in terms of that, but I think we've had very good cooperation with the banks. Firstly, I think that has been a key in being able to develop the intelligence that we're talking about, and then obviously the sharing information speaks for itself. Just as a matter of interest, we had recently had a very successful prosecution on a well-known bank robber, which I think has certainly contributed to the deterrent effect in bank robberies.
You mentioned more sharing of information there, which definitely means that the private sector has also become a little bit more hands-on with regards to this. But what have you done for the consumer? Have you created awareness with regard to them, and as well as staff on a lower level when it comes to bank robberies?
Well, Gugu, it is one of the key focus areas, is creating awareness amongst the general public. A very good example is probably in a month we'll be embarking on an awareness campaign relating to robberies, we refer to as associated robberies, but follow-on robberies, which I think have contributed to the increase in the crime stats, specifically on the robbery front. In carrying cash safely, those are things that we embark on in terms of creating public awareness.
Looking at the banks, I was aware, going to one of the big shopping malls, it's actually very difficult to get into a bank now. Would that have played part of it? I mean, I'm not sure how that would have worked from the previous year to this year to achieve such a large drop. But when you get to the bank now, you can't see inside. You've got to go through quite a process to get in. Not that many people necessarily go to the bank anymore. But just to get into the bank is extremely difficult.
Well, David, I would think that it varies from bank to bank. But the fact of the matter is that I don't think the banks are trying to make it as difficult as possible for clients to transact and to interact with staff in the bank. Yeah, I presume it's one of those security measures that, if those are merely some of the measures that have been implemented, but probably they'll be phased out in due course, and they vary from year to year. So it probably hasn't had an impact.
Kevin, you mentioned here the bank in transit heists as well as the bank robberies. That's the physical movement of cash. But what happens what trends are you seeing rather when it comes to internet banking as well as people using banking apps on their phones? Are there people who are trying to fish for information? That's the IT term, I take it, as well as or intercept between the banking client as well as the banks themselves?
Look, the e-crime obviously is also down to a certain extent. Why I say a certain extent is obviously the bit of fluctuation in terms of month in and month out. Phishing is one of those areas that we continually seem to having challenges with. But obviously, in general, the commercial side of things has also shown an decline.
We've talked about cash in transit and bank robberies. ATMs, because that's where it's a public space. It has to be by definition easy to get to, otherwise people can't get to the money. What about the stats there?
Again, the same thing. I think significant arrests in the past year have contributed to this, particularly from SAPS. SAPS have a dedicated unit and have dedicated units in particular provinces that are dealing with this. Obviously, a lot of association with the banking industry and banks in itself. And I believe that it has contributed to addressing the syndicates involved in these crimes.
How much of that kind of crime is syndicated?
Well, we believe it's certainly organised. You don't, on the spur of the moment, decide you're going to attack an ATM. It's obviously organised. You look at the time of the day. The attacks are directed at the ATM and obviously directed at the banks, not clients. And that's why you're having these happening at late in the evenings when there's less transactions happening from a clientele point of view.
Kevin, you also mentioned, just to close off with that, you've got a few tips for South Africans not to ensure that they won't become victims of banking crimes. What exactly are those tips?
Well, I think generally across the board it is to seek to minimise opportunities for becoming victim of crime, and in the various facets within the banking industry, from violent to commercial crime also. I mean, personal identity is a very important one. Is make sure that you don't provide people with your personal identity. Carrying cash is one that I mentioned a little earlier. Something that we're very, very concerned about because of the amount of cash amounts that are being carried by the general public out there, and rather look at the alternatives to carry larger sums of cash, because you're going to become a victim. I
know several shops, the place where I buy fresh fish, they discourage you giving them cash, and they're trying to get to be a cashless shop. So that's the trend. If you want to stop cash robberies, stop cash being in circulation. We'll have to end it there, but encouraging news on the bank robberies and heists in particular. Thanks to Kevin Twine, who is General Manager for Violent Crimes at Sabric.